I couldn't believe it. I was stunned when I discovered the silver gauntlets in Impa's house, and suddenly, memories of what happened before I pulled the Master Sword came back to me. I wasn't sure if it was because in light of everything my priorities had pushed it out of my mind, or if my already faulty memory had been further tampered with. Regardless, I now remembered that Neburu was in trouble, and I had left her back there for 7 years. But despite that, I could sense that she was still alive, that she needed my help. I turned to leave when, much to my surprise, Ryaru stood in the doorway, blocking my path. He was trying to calm me down when he saw I had the gauntlets, but I wasn't hearing any of it. I was angry that they had the gauntlets all this time, and I was wondering how they got them. And that's when it became clear to me, the resemblance. All of this time, it was him. He took the silver gauntlets from me that day, and all this time they've been ignoring the problem in the desert. From what I had remembered, he, like the rest of Hyrule, didn't trust the Gerudos, but I had this feeling. The Spirit Temple was undoubtedly the final temple needed, and that maybe... Ryaru was still trying to get me to hear him out, but I pushed past him. Regardless of whatever feelings or objections he and the other sages had, I was going back, and I was going to save Neburu. I put on the silver gauntlets and was prepared to head west, but then the memories of fighting the Iron Knuckle returned to me, as well as the other dangers I had found in just half of that temple. Fortunately for me, Big Oron's sword was ready. I could use a stronger weapon for this fight. I mounted Epona and headed for the valley. Navi actually said that rather nervously, claiming that now Ganondorf was king of all Hyrule, the desert might not be safe anymore. Sure, the Gerudos were against him 7 years ago, but ever since Neburu was taken, who knows if their allegiance had shifted or not. But Navi still agreed with me. The Desert Colossus had to be the final temple. Sheik even said that it was inside the Goddess of Sand. We had no choice. I was discouraged by what the Master Craftsman had told me. It seemed like ever since Neburu disappeared, the tactics of the Gerudo became more brutal, and they were more fearful of outsiders. To make things even worse, I had no actual idea of how to get to the temple on my own. All I knew was that it was across the desert, and the gates into the desert were closed. So if I wanted to get through, I was going to need information. The fortress was heavily guarded. I decided to sneak back in under the cover of night so as not to be noticed. Sneaking into the fortress was surprisingly easy. Sneaking around, not so much. I had no idea what I was trying to accomplish, but I needed to get some inside help. And that's when I found the carpenters. They actually were kept in separate cells all over the fortress, something about disorienting the prisoners in case one of them escaped. They'd be captured again before they could find and rescue the others or escape on their own. But unlike what the game depicts, I didn't have to fight an individual Gerudo guard for each one. I feel like if they did, they'd have set the whole base on alert. I managed to pick the locks to get the first 3 carpenters out, and each gave me bits of information. But the 4th carpenter was when the guards finally noticed me and attacked. The one-on-one fight brought out more latent memories from me. The very least it did was help me form a strategy on how to defeat my opponent. But despite defeating her and freeing the last carpenter, the other guards arrived, and I was surrounded and captured. The Gerudo that fought me held her blade at my throat while the others searched me. I didn't know what I could say to them to get them to listen, but I did remember hearing them mention how impressed they were that I managed to get past them like this. That's when one of them pulled a piece of parchment from my bag, something that caught their leader's eye. It was the Gerudo membership card that Neburu had given to me 7 years ago. She asked me where I got it from, and I told her it was from Neburu. She removed her face mask, revealing herself to be a veil. the very person who wrote the card in the first place. She suddenly recognized me as the kid they captured all those years ago. She chuckled at how well I developed my thieving skills. The Gerudo were a bit mad that I had disappeared all those years ago when Neburu was taken. They thought I had snuck away to keep the silver gauntlets for myself. I threw it back at them that they ran away when the witches attacked, whereas I was taken. But now, after all this time, I've come back to help Neburu. They believed that it was probably too late, as no one had seen or heard from her in 7 years. But they had noticed something. While everyone was too afraid to go into the spirit temple, everything seemed so quiet, like it had been deserted, at least until recently, when activity in the temple started up again. So regardless, there was someone alive in there now. I managed to convince them that they had nothing to lose. I was, after all, a member of their tribe, and I was the only one willing to go right for the spirit temple to find out what really happened. I only asked that they let the final carpenter, Shiro, go. Now I was allowed to move freely about the fortress and Gerudo society, but before the carpenters left, they tried to warn me that the Gerudos couldn't be trusted. They claimed that in Neburu's absence, the Gerudos no longer behave chivalrously and have become more brutal. Worse, they had heard rumors that Neburu was still at the spirit temple, brainwashing people to turn evil. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew I had to go and see it for myself. They opened the gate for me to use, but they recommended that I get in some training before I try to brave the desert on my own. So I took their advice and hit up both the archery range as well as the Gerudo training ground. They were impressed at the power of the silver gauntlets, but unlike what the game depicts, I didn't get the ice arrows from this. Like the fire arrows from before, I just sort of remembered the spell to do it, and I have no idea why. The game depicts me as being unable to go through the desert on Epona. It was their attempt to shoehorn in more puzzles to make it more interesting. According to their logic, Epona would sink into the sand. In real life, as soon as the Gerudos opened the gates for me, I rode into the desert. It was still a harrowing journey with blistering winds and little visibility. I still had to rely on the Phantom Guide in order to get there, but before long, Epona and I were able to arrive at the oasis. It was strange being back. It was almost like I had never left. Either way, the only real obstacle in our way to get to the temple were the Levers, bizarre living cactus creatures that live in the sands. I was surprised that I had memories of them as well. Where the hell had I been? Nehru's Love. I wish I had known about this spell back when I was a kid. I could have really used it. I made my way toward the temple, and unlike the game, Sheik confronted me before going in. I wondered how he had gotten there when I noticed Gabora flying overhead. I assumed Sheik was going to stop me, but much to my surprise, Sheik agreed with me. He told me that the Gerudos had been fractured from Hyrule society for too long, and the key to success was to bring them into the cause. Sheik confirmed my belief. Neburu was the sixth sage, and she was still alive inside the temple. I was certain that I was headed in for a spectacular fight. After all, Ganondorf's minions had been using the place even before he took over everything. Sheik told me what the situation really was. There was something off about the temple. While it had further spawned out creatures for Ganondorf's army, usually terrorizing the Gerudos, something had happened in recent weeks where the monsters decreased in number. The powers of the Spirit Sage were awakening and fighting back against the portal, which meant that Neburu was still inside the temple, but she was unable to fully awaken as a sage without the help of the Hero of Time. I was hoping that Sheik would join me, and I would get more information about who he is out of him. But of course, he vanished into the wind. But he didn't go far. He'd be back, because this time, Sheik was keeping a closer watch on me. Yeah, as I mentioned, none of this happened the way the game depicts. I'm mostly leaving this footage in for completion's sake, but this entire section was unnecessary. All the pieces had already fallen into place during my childhood to be ready for me as an adult. I find this inclusion in the game an interesting mechanic, underutilized, I should say, but also incredibly contrived, especially with how the game ends. I had no reason to go back, and I couldn't even if I wanted to. Brace yourselves, people. This is where history greatly diverges from the game you know. When I reached the end of the east wing of the temple, I found another iron knuckle waiting here for me. What the game doesn't show you is that this one was equipped with the mirror shield, the other key to the temple. I was immediately overcome with rage at seeing another one of these things, and I immediately went in for the attack. The Big Oron sword is very powerful. I had scoured all over the temple, certain I had cleared every room. The secret lair in the center of the temple was masterfully hidden. This will take a lot of explaining, and I know you're not going to understand any of it. When I finally encountered the witches, Kome and Kotake, I paused for a moment in disbelief. Fragmented memories of them flashed before my eyes. I at first shook them away, knowing that I had of course seen them before when they kidnapped Naburu 7 years ago. I demanded to know where Naburu was. They didn't just regard me as an intruder in the temple. They specifically noted that they had been waiting for me, and I had fallen into their trap. Now, their secret weapon was ready. They left the room, leaving me to fight the third and final Iron Knuckle, one far more powerful and more imposing than the others. In my rage, I immediately drew the Bigoron sword and attacked. I was surprised to realize that the creature was capable of blocking my attacks. Still, due to my vigor and improved range thanks to my weapon, I was able to make short work of this thing. But my satisfied elation quickly turned to horror at what I realized I had done. The Iron Knuckle was Nibiru. She collapsed to the ground, exhausted and injured from the fight. I immediately went to her side, not truly understanding what had happened. I assumed the witches brainwashed her to serve evil, and in my horror, I looked at the blood on the Bigoron sword. The Master Sword would not have harmed an innocent like Nibiru, but with the Bigoron sword, I could have easily killed her and not even known about it. The witches returned, but it was different, to say the least here. They didn't talk about brainwashing her to work for Ganondorf at all. They instead talked about how dangerous I was as a threat, and how they had underestimated me. They wouldn't afford to hold back any further. But much to my surprise, with their magic powers, they actually healed Nibiru's wounds. I was confused, but I was certain I knew what I had to do. That's when Sheik revealed himself in the room. He told me that those witches, Kome and Kotake, were Ganondorf's adoptive mothers. They taught him all of the black magic that made him into a powerful sorcerer. He suspected that they fed his ambition to seek further power and conquer all of Hyrule. Nibiru had finally regained consciousness and was surprised to see me, realizing who I was. Sheik told me to go deal with the witches, offering to look after Nibiru while she was still weak. I did as he said, but I did notice that Nibiru had actually called out to me as I crossed into the room. She was trying to stop me. For honesty's sake, they never once mentioned Ganondorf, nor did they call him great. They instead talked about how they would devote all of their magic power to destroy me. Like the game shows, I had to use the mirror shield to reflect their opposite elements back at the other. What was strange was, I had memories of fighting in a similar battle before, even using the mirror shield. I had no idea where these memories came from, but they were starting to scare me. The opponent that I saw myself fighting in this particular flashback filled me with terrors I had never known before. What the game doesn't allow was the fact that the fire and ice arrows were very useful in this fight when I couldn't quite aim the shield well enough. This was admittedly disturbing, but fortunately this fused form of theirs gave me a better opportunity to actually strike at them. Okay, time to unload the real truth onto you. This fight didn't end so much with a victory as it did a stalemate. Neburu burst into the room and told the two of us to stop fighting, and much to my surprise, she was actually able to reason with Twin Rova, causing her to split to her two counterparts. They were at first confused as to why Neburu stopped them, claiming that this was their chance to take out one of Ganondorf's most powerful lieutenants. And that's when I finally exclaimed my confusion and demanded to know just what was going on. Neburu explained to me that this was all a trap meant to kill Dark Link and not me. But I was even more confused after that, so Neburu explained from the beginning. You see, Kome and Kotake were the spiritual leaders of the Gerudo tribe. It was their duty to raise and care for the Gerudo king from birth, as well as teach him the ways of magic. They did teach Ganondorf the ways of dark magic, and did inspire him to begin his subterfuge in Hyrule, but the reason they did it was because they had dreamed he would lead the Gerudo race to glory and had helped make things better for their people. Instead, Ganondorf only became greedy and power-hungry, seeking only to serve himself. The reason the Gerudos turned on him was because he had done little to help their society in his quest for power, and during his reign as king of all Hyrule, he had done nothing to help them. Kome and Kotake had grown ashamed of their son over the years, knowing that he'd forgotten his own heritage and betrayed them, especially considering that he had the nerve to desecrate the sacred spirit temple, defiling his own culture. Upon his orders, they did take Neburu away when they suspected her of betraying him, and imprisoned her deep in the temple, but much to my surprise, they revealed that they had a change of heart and defected from Ganondorf, abandoning his cause for his betrayal. Kome and Kotake got a better look at me, and were surprised by the sight of me. They were very embarrassed and very apologetic that they had attacked me. It was so bizarre to see them so enthusiastically seeking my forgiveness. They claimed that with their old eyes and the inadequate lighting in the temple, they had mistaken me for my dark counterpart. But they would surely have never attacked me if they had known that it was me. And then they revealed the great debt that they owed me, that they sought to repay. I was about to ask them what they meant when the memory fragments flashed before my eyes, and this time, I was about to get some answers. I was able to piece together events from the memories. I remembered being in a swamp. The two of them owned a potion shop, and Kome had gone missing, attacked by someone in the woods while she gathered mushrooms. And I saved her, restored her to health, and she and her sister thanked me, wanting one day to repay me. They were elated that I had remembered them after it had been so long. They continued Neburu's story that they intended to double-cross Ganondorf, allying with Neburu, with the intent to leave her as the queen and leader of the Gerudo tribe. But when Ganondorf obtained the Triforce and took over Hyrule, they panicked. They spirited Neburu away to a safe place, fleeing off to a far-off land called Termina. Hearing that name awakened something in me, like it was the piece of my life that had been missing ever since I woke up. They tried to start over and live in peace, far away from Ganondorf's rule, but Termina ran into trouble, and that's when they claimed that I showed up. During the darkest times in their early years there, I swept in like a refreshing breeze and went about solving everyone's problems for them. They mentioned how I helped them out of a jam when I met them there, and that they had seen me do the most incredible, awe-inspiring things they had ever seen. Over the years, they had gradually regained hope and became inspired by my courage. Courage enough to return here just a month before I had woken up in the Temple of Light. When they returned, they had to fight their way into the temple, which explained why the temple's activity had become so strange to the Gerudo. They formed their own resistance against Ganondorf. While they weren't bold enough to confront him yet, they had a plan. They didn't believe in the legends of the Hero of Time, but they knew that Neburu had a special connection to the Spirit Temple. They thought that if they trained her in combat with magic iron knuckle armor and augmented her abilities with their dark magic, they could create a warrior strong enough to take on Ganondorf's minions. and because she knew Ganondorf almost as well as they did, she'd be perfect for identifying his weaknesses and fighting him head-on. That's why they used her as the Iron Knuckle to be the guardian of this temple, to test her prowess on Dark Link when he came. I was about to ask what all of this meant. How could I have possibly been in this Termina when I was supposedly sealed in the Sacred Realm for all these years? Unfortunately, we were interrupted when someone else entered the room. It was Dark Link himself, and he had overheard everything that the witches had told me. He applauded their failed attempts, as well as for having hidden themselves away in the secret chamber of the temple. He apparently had spent weeks trying to find the traitors who had hidden themselves away in here. The two heard their fill of his gloating and attacked him with their elemental magic. However, whether it be exhaustion from fighting me or their dark magic being ineffective on him, Dark Link had knocked them back and prepared to finish them off. That's when I stepped in, saving their lives. We fought again for the third time. I now realized that this was what I had to finish. He was the boss of the Spirit Temple, and one way or another, I would have to end him today. The battle was fierce, as he wasn't falling for any of my old tricks like he had during our first fight. It was far more dangerous than before. Kome then revealed to me the secret to beating him, claiming that I had to fight the darkness with light, but I had been separated from the mirror shield earlier in the battle. Fortunately, as we dueled, Neburu took up the shield and threw it to me, allowing me to catch it, and shine the bright light right into Dark Link's face. The attack stunned him and caused him to back off, but much to my shock, it wasn't destroying him. He claimed that there is no light that can destroy the darkness. He overpowered me during the fight and pinned me. He was about to run me through when suddenly Sheik appeared, diving into the fight and kicking him away. The two of them began to fight, Sheik holding him off to give me enough time to recover. I wondered why the mirror shield hadn't worked, staring back at my own reflection in its shiny surface. And then I had an epiphany. This creature was me. It was my darkness. I created it. Every time I had anger and hatred, all of my angst against being an outcast, all of my thoughts of revenge against Ganondorf, all of my fears and doubts, my guilt over losing the Deku Shield, over what had happened to Hyrule, all because of me, all of it was feeding him, making him stronger. I realized then that my quest for revenge wasn't to kill Ganondorf. It was to kill my own guilt over not being able to save the Deku Tree, over failing to save my friends, and putting all of Hyrule through this nightmare. And now I knew what I had to do to end this once and for all. The Shadow had disengaged with Sheik and now came after me, ready to finish me off. And it was at that point that I was ready. I forgave myself. And at that moment, Dark Link disappeared, passing through me into nothing. It was finally over, and I had gotten some perspective. I could finally set things right, and now that he was gone, Neburu's power as the Spirit Sage fully awakened. Kome and Kotake claimed that they were proud of her for achieving this, and they had learned to put their faith in the true hero of time. They admitted that their dark magic was not the way, and hoped that in the light of good magic, Neburu could lead the Gerudo into a future of peace and prosperity. They revealed that the battle had completely exhausted them, and they were ready to move on, much more peacefully than the game would have you believe. Neburu, of course, gave her implications, as I mentioned before. All I asked of her in return was to go to the Gerudo and ask them to join our cause in the resistance against Ganondorf and prepare for battle. War was coming. And with that, I had awakened all 6 sages, but unlike in the game, Rairu didn't tell me to go back to the Temple of Time. It was still too dangerous. Instead, when I returned to the Spirit Temple from the Chamber of Sages, I realized that Sheik was still here. I was surprised that he hadn't disappeared. I was about to congratulate him for holding off my dark side for as long as he did, when I noticed his condition. He was badly hurt and staggering about. He fell to the ground unconscious, bleeding from a wound on his abdomen.